The sky was never meant to hold such smoke. Once blue horizons were smothered beneath a veil of ash, where the air itself tasted of rust and burning oil. The clamor of guttural laughter echoed from shattered manufactorum spires, crude banners of bone and iron flapping in winds thick with promethium stench. In the ruins below, men, women, and children crept through alleys like vermin, stripped of names and futures, reduced to little more than prey. Every footstep risked discovery. Every whisper risked chains or worse. For the orcs had come, and when they arrive, there is no treaty, no reason, no mercy, only the grinding machine of war that devours without pause. To live here is to know silence as a weapon, breath as betrayal, and hope as something half forgotten. Before we descend into that silence, I ask you only this: if you find value in these stories, if you wish others to glimpse the hidden lives buried beneath the Imperium's endless wars, then share this tale. Leave your mark and subscribe so more voices may be heard in the shadows. For even in this universe where stars are drowned by endless night, stories are lanterns against the dark. Now let us walk among the forgotten and hear what silence conceals. The first sound was not a scream but a thud like iron crushing stone. It carried down the narrow hab streets, rattling loose tiles and scattering the ash that never seemed to settle. Children froze where they crouched, hands pressed over mouths, eyes wide in the half-dark. Mothers drew them close. Fathers pressed their backs against cold ferrocrete walls, all willing themselves into silence. Because when the orcs came, they did not hunt with stealth or patience. They hunted with sound. The streets were long ago stripped of their names. What had once been a thriving district of manufactoria, shrines, and stacked worker habs now lay reduced to a skeletal maze of rubble. Cracked Aquila stared with hollow eyes from toppled walls, their wings broken in mockery of the Imperium that once promised protection. The air was thick with dust and the sour stench of oil spilled from wrecked engines. Even the sky seemed wounded, its colors leached into gray and orange, lit by the endless fires of orc encampments outside the city's heart. Among the ruins, survival meant swallowing one's own voice. The orcs were not blind. They could smell weakness, hear a cough from half a block away, and laugh as they dragged prey into the open. Those who could not master silence did not last, and so the people learned. They wrapped cloth around the feet of children, taught them to breathe shallowly, to weep into sleeves instead of air. A newborn's cry was a death sentence, and so prayers were whispered to the God Emperor for strength, not for salvation. Every ruin carried its ghosts. Mira, a young woman with hair matted by soot and eyes too old for her age, remembered when these streets were alive. She could still see her father bent over the manufactorum's press lines, hear the steady chant of hymns as workers passed the hours with song. Now the only chants came from green-skinned throats, brutish and mocking, carried on the wind like the sound of war drums. She had not sung since the day they came. The silence was both armor and poison. It kept her alive, but it hollowed her out. On one particular night, the silence was broken. The orcs had found a cache of promethium barrels buried beneath a crumbling shrine, and when they cracked it open, laughter erupted. The sound rolled across the city like thunder, grotesque and jubilant. Mira crouched with others in a collapsed hab block, her heart beating faster with each echo. A man beside her clenched his teeth until blood dripped from his lip, so desperate was he to keep from crying out. The children shook in their mother's arms, their fear as palpable as the stink of smoke. Then came the worst part, the waiting. Orc joy never ended where it began. They smashed the barrels, set fires for no reason but delight, and then wandered drunkenly into the ruins, eager to share their amusement. Each human heart in hiding knew the pattern. Laughter meant footsteps, and footsteps meant death. A shadow fell across the broken wall. Mira's breath caught as a massive silhouette lurched past, its gait heavy and careless. The greenskin's tusked mouth was still wet with drink, its skin glistening with grime. In one hand it carried a jagged cleaver, still dripping with some unclean substance. It paused, sniffing the air, head cocked like a predator catching the faintest trace. Mira pressed herself deeper into the rubble, her lips pressed into ash, her eyes burning. The orc snorted, laughed to itself, and moved on. Only then did Mira dare breathe again. Around her others exhaled silently, relief mingling with the bitter knowledge that survival was no victory. Survival was simply another day lived beneath a sky no longer theirs. That night, as they huddled together in the dark, Mira wondered how long silence could protect them. She had seen men crack beneath its weight, whispering prayers too loudly, sobbing when memory grew too sharp. She had seen mothers abandon infants who could not stop crying, offering their tiny bodies to the ruins as sacrifices so others might live. She had seen fathers rush into the streets with makeshift blades, roaring defiance, only to be torn apart in seconds. Silence was the only shield left, but it was not invincible. And so when dawn broke, painted in smoke and firelight, the survivors emerged like shadows themselves. They moved in silence, scouring the wreckage for scraps of food, strips of cloth, fragments of metal that might be sharpened into tools. Mira joined them, her stomach gnawing with hunger, her body weary with more than fatigue. Every step was a risk, every glance a prayer. Then from deep within the ruins came another sound. Not orcish laughter this time, but something softer. A muffled sob. Mira froze, her blood cold. The others froze too, eyes darting in terror. Someone had broken the silence. Someone was about to pay. The sound was faint, yet in the brittle silence it seemed louder than thunder. Mira's eyes swept the ruined blocks until she found the source. A boy no older than 8, crouched near a broken statue of the Emperor. His hands trembled as he tried to stifle his tears, but the weight of hunger, fear, and exhaustion had broken him. His mother clamped her hand over his mouth too late. The sound had already carried. All around, survivors sank into stillness. It was not the quiet of compassion, but of dread, as if the city itself held its breath. They had all seen it before. One slip, one sound, and the orcs descended. No one dared move toward the child, for movement itself risked drawing attention. Mira's jaw clenched. Her body screamed to run to him, yet her legs stayed rooted, the lesson of survival chaining her in place. Then it came. The guttural bark of greenskin laughter, nearer this time, rolling through the alleys like a tide. Heavy boots clattered against ferrocrete, metal scrap dangling from armor plates. A hunting party, the orcs had heard. The mother pulled the boy into her arms, smothering his cries against her chest. She whispered words too soft for Mira to hear, though the tone was unmistakable. Pleading, desperate. Mira wanted to believe she was begging the Emperor for aid, but the truth was simpler. She was begging her child for silence. The first orc rounded the corner. Its bulk blotted out what little dawn light filtered through the smoke. Jagged plates of scavenged armor clinked as it moved, its massive cleaver dragging sparks against the stone. Behind it came another, smaller only in comparison, hefting a crude firearm the size of a man. Their yellow eyes gleamed as they sniffed the air. The survivors did not run. To run was to make sound. Instead, they became statues pressed into shadows, hearts thundering. Mira crouched lower, her breath shallow, her gaze fixed on the boy and his mother. She prayed they could hold, prayed the orcs would pass, prayed the god emperor still cared for such prayers. The boy whimpered again. The orc's head snapped toward the sound. With a roar that shook the rubble, they charged. The mother screamed, clutching her son, but the cleaver struck before she could rise. The sound was wet, final. Blood sprayed across the cracked stones as the boy tumbled from her arms, his small body trembling with terror. Mira covered her mouth, nails biting into her skin. The silence was shattered now. Screams filled the street. The orcs bellowed with delight. One scooped the boy up in a massive hand, dangling him like a doll as it laughed. The child kicked and cried, his voice echoing far too loudly through the ruins. Other survivors broke, fleeing into alleys, their footsteps betraying them as more greenskins poured in from the encampment. Mira did not move. She knew what came next. She had seen it before. The orcs never killed all at once. They made sport of it. And as she watched the boy's small hands claw uselessly at the giant fingers, something inside her cracked. It was not pity. It was not rage. It was a terrible emptiness, as though silence itself had reached its limit within her. She could not scream. She could not fight, but she could no longer bear to remain still. Crawling back through the rubble, she reached for a shard of twisted metal, useless against a greenskin but sharp enough to cut. Her pulse hammered as she gripped it. The boy's cries rose higher, shriller, until the orc slammed him against a wall to silence him. His tiny body went limp, his blood mixing with the ash. The laughter that followed shook Mira to her core, but she did not let go of the shard. Not this time. Around her, the survivors scattered, their silence broken into chaos. The orcs reveled in it, chasing them like hunters through a field. Yet Mira stayed low, her hand trembling on the shard, her gaze fixed on the nearest greenskin's exposed ankle, where crude armor left patches of green flesh bare. She knew it was madness. She knew she would die. But for the first time since the occupation began, the silence did not feel like protection. It felt like a prison. She shifted forward, heart pounding, waiting for her moment, and then, from somewhere deeper in the ruins, a sound unlike any other rolled across the streets. A low, resonant hum, metallic and alien. The orcs froze, their laughter choking off as their ears twitched toward the noise. Mira felt it in her teeth, in her bones, as if the rubble itself vibrated. Whatever it was, it did not belong to greenskins. The hum deepened, reverberating like the beating of some vast machine heart beneath the earth. Dust sifted from the ruins. Pebbles danced upon the cracked stones, and even the fires in the distance seemed to flicker with unease. The orcs exchanged guttural growls, their crude instincts struggling to interpret what their dull minds could not understand. For them, anything unknown was either prey or rival. The boy's broken body was dropped carelessly to the ground as the hunters turned toward the sound. Weapons lifted, eager for fresh sport. Mira crouched lower, her shard of metal clutched in white-knuckled hands. Her heart pounded as she watched the greenskins hesitate. For a moment she thought, hoped, that it might be salvation, that the Emperor himself had answered with thunder from the deep. Yet another voice inside her whispered caution. In this galaxy, not all that opposed orcs was a friend of mankind. The hum resolved into pulses, rhythmic and deliberate, echoing like the toll of some colossal bell. Then came light, a faint glow filtering through the smoke, cold and unnatural, casting long, sharp shadows across the shattered streets. Mira dared a glance past her cover. Shapes were moving through the ruins, silhouettes tall and angular, metal gleaming where dawnlight touched them. The orcs bellowed in recognition. Their laughter returned, booming and savage. More fightin'. On roared, its voice echoing off Ferrocrete walls. The others slammed their cleavers against armor plates, their crude voices joining in chorus. Wah! They charged toward the glow, leaving the corpses and the trembling survivors behind. Mira did not move. She knew the stories whispered in the dark. Fragments of rumor passed between starving lips, metal warriors that did not die, who rose from the sand and the shadows, whose eyes glowed with soulless fire. Necrons, the word hissed like poison in the night. Whether truth or delirium, she did not want to see. The clash erupted like thunder. Orc roars were answered not with human screams but with a silence more terrifying. No war cries, no laughter. Only the hiss of energy weapons cutting the air and the sharp crack of matter unmade. Mira pressed her hands over her ears as light flared, green and unholy, searing the smoke. Shadows danced across the rubble as bodies were hurled aside. The silence of the metal warriors was worse than the orcs' noise, for it spoke of something without pity, without hunger, without end. The survivors cowered, torn between terror of discovery and the desperate hope that the two monsters might destroy each other. Mira stared at the shard in her hands, its edge dull, her defiance meaningless before such powers. She was not a warrior. She was not even a voice in this war. She was dust caught between titans. Minutes stretched into hours. The noise rose and fell, orc howls breaking into panicked shrieks, then silenced abruptly by bursts of emerald fire. When it ended, the streets were hushed again, though not with the fragile peace of before. It was the silence of a grave. Mira dared to lift her head. The orcs were gone. What remained of them was scattered across the ruins, their bodies charred and broken. The green light still lingered, casting eerie halos over the carnage. Mira's breath caught as one of the metal figures moved into view. Tall, skeletal, its frame gleaming like polished bone. Its eyes burned with cold fire as it scanned the rubble, searching. Slowly, inexorably, it turned its gaze toward the survivors. Mira froze, every muscle locking. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint crackle of burning flesh. The Necron tilted its head, studying them as one might study insects caught beneath glass. It did not speak. It did not roar. It simply watched, and in its gaze Mira felt the weight of eternity pressing down. At last the figure moved on, vanishing back into the smoke with the others. The glow receded, the hum fading into the distance until only the ash and the dead remained. The survivors released their breaths in unsteady gasps. Some sobbed, others whispered thanks to the Emperor, though their voices trembled with uncertainty. Was this deliverance or merely a reprieve before the next horror? Mira sat in the rubble, the shard slipping from her grasp. Her chest rose and fell with ragged breaths. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew this. The silence had changed. It was no longer a shield alone. It was a weight pressing harder, heavier, carrying the memory of screams and the echo of that unearthly hum. The ashen streets had become a graveyard of sound, and Mira understood with dreadful clarity that survival meant more than hiding. It meant enduring whatever walked these ruins next. The days that followed blurred together, marked not by the rising or setting of a sun hidden behind smoke, but by the rhythm of chains. Iron links, heavy and crude, clattered with every step the survivors were forced to take. They were no longer shadows clinging to rubble. They were captives, herded like cattle beneath the watchful eyes of their green-skinned masters. Mira felt the weight of the shackle around her ankle, as if it were part of her body now, a constant gnawing reminder that silence had failed her. She remembered the boys' cries, the hum that followed, the skeletal warriors that passed like phantoms. Yet none of that mattered here in the pits of the orc encampment. The Wah had many hungers, and human lives were simply fodder to feed them. The orcs valued little beyond war, but they were not mindless. They saw use in human hands, frail though they were, nimble enough to pry apart scavenged engines or mend crude armor plates. The captives were driven into makeshift workshops, rusted manufactoria stripped of their sanctity, their shrines desecrated by greenskin glyphs scrawled across sacred stone. Here the work never ended. Fires roared as humans hammered under threat of death, binding scrap to scrap, breathing in fumes that burned the lungs raw. Mira's task was simple yet endless, carrying jagged plates of metal from one end of the yard to another, her skin blistering where sharp edges cut. Her hands bled freely, leaving crimson streaks on the iron. Beside her, an older man collapsed beneath the weight of his burden. The orc overseer noticed immediately. Its whip, a chain tipped with cruel hooks, lashed out. The man's scream tore across the workshop, silencing the clang of hammers. The overseer laughed, the sound echoing off the rusted walls. And when the man did not rise, it crushed his skull beneath a boot. The workers returned to their labor without a word. They knew the lesson well, yet labor was not the only fate. Some captives were dragged to crude arenas, circles of scorched stone where orcs gathered to jeer and howl. Here survival became a performance. Men and women were forced to fight each other with broken tools. Their struggles nothing but entertainment for their captors. The greenskins laughed at the weak, cheered at the strong, and always demanded more blood. Mira watched once as two brothers were thrown into the ring. She could not look away as hunger and fear drove them to strike each other down, the crowd roaring approval. The winner was not spared. He was fed alive to a chained squig. Children, too, were not overlooked. Small hands were shoved into wrecked engines, ordered to pry loose wiring or connect circuits where adults could not fit. The smallest were treated as playthings, tossed between hulking greenskins until their bones broke. Mira had once believed there could be no cruelty greater than silence, but here, surrounded by laughter, she realized her mistake. Silence had been mercy. This was degradation. At night, when the work finally ceased, the captives were herded into pens made of twisted rebar and scrap. They huddled close together for warmth, their eyes hollow, their voices barely whispers. Mira lay awake in the press of bodies, listening to the low moans of the dying, the muffled sobs of children, and the distant thunder of orc drums. She felt the iron against her ankle and wondered if freedom was even a word worth remembering. Yet in that darkness, whispers moved like sparks. Some spoke of resistance, of stolen blades and sabotaged engines. Others told rumors of Imperial forces gathering in the void, though no one knew if it was truth or hope. And still others whispered prayers, fragmented hymns passed from parent to child, reminding them that the Emperor watched even here. In this pit of rust and blood, Mira listened, her eyes on the smoke-stained stars barely visible through the gaps in the pen's roof. She wanted to believe the whispers, to hold on to the idea that endurance meant more than simply surviving. But as the drums grew louder, as orcs prepared themselves for yet another raid, she wondered if whispers could ever rise above the roar of a wah.